There was a man once, not so different from any of us, who spent his days chasing comfort like it was the only prize worth winning. He built walls around himself, not of brick or stone, but of routine and predictability, believing that safety was the same thing as strength. He thought he was charting a steady course, keeping his ship away from all the storms, when all he was really doing was dropping anchor in shallow water. He'd watch the horizon sometimes and feel a faint tug of something bigger, something further out, but the warmth of his familiar harbor always pulled him back. He knew deep down that a calm sea never made a skilled sailor, but the thought of the crashing waves, the cold spray, the possibility of capsizing, it was too much to bear. So he stayed, convinced that the comfort he had was a blessing, never realizing it was a slow, quiet curse, gnawing at the very legacy he hoped to build. A man can get so used to the easy path, he forgets the hard road is the one that leads somewhere worth going. That man, he was Wayne. 48 years old, every one of them earned, etched into the corners of his eyes and the calluses on his palms. He wasn't a stranger to hard work. Hell, he practically invented it. For 30 years, he'd been under the hoods of half the cars in his working-class town, a mechanic through and through. His body was a testament to his trade, shoulders wide as a workbench, arms corded with muscle that moved with the practiced ease of someone who knew every bolt, every spark plug, every hidden fault in a machine. His back, well, that had a story of its own, a constant dull ache that was just part of the furniture now, like the scent of oil and gasoline that clung to his clothes, and even sometimes his skin after a shower. He moved with a quiet strength, a kind of contained power that didn't need to shout to be heard. His face was a landscape of wrinkles, each line a map of a laugh, a worry, a moment of intense concentration spent coaxing a sputtering engine back to life. There was a gruffness to him, sure, a directness that cut through small talk like a torch through rusted metal. He didn't waste words, not unless they were absolutely necessary, and then they were usually practical, direct instructions, or a terse assessment of a broken exhaust system. But beneath that gruff exterior, if you knew how to look, if you paid attention to the way his eyes softened when he talked about his kids, or the careful precision with which he'd help an old lady struggling with her groceries in the parking lot, you'd see the fairness, the deep-seated reliability that made him the kind of man you'd trust with your last dollar or your broken-down car on the side of the highway. His hands, they were his storytellers. Big, scarred, knuckles swollen from years of gripping wrenches and prying at seized parts. The skin was ingrained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove, a permanent badge of honor from a life spent getting dirty so others could stay clean. They were strong, capable hands, but sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, they would clench and unclench slowly, as if trying to grasp something just beyond their reach. His eyes, the color of worn asphalt, held a quiet intensity, but also a tiredness, a subtle resignation that hinted at battles fought and settled, not always victoriously. They were eyes that had seen the same sun rise in the same sky, morning after morning, promising the same day of fixing what was broken, and then going home to do it all again. He looked like a man who'd built a decent life with his own two hands, but one who might have, somewhere along the line, forgotten to build a ladder out of the rut. Every weekday, that ladder stayed exactly where it was. Wayne's world began precisely at 5 a.m., a digital glow on the bedside clock cutting through the pre-dawn quiet of their small, well-maintained house. Built sturdy in the 70s, it was the kind of home that had seen countless scraped knees and spilled milkshakes, the kind that smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the floorboards creaking a familiar tune, and start the coffee. Sarah would usually be stirring by the time he was pouring his first cup, a silent, comforting ritual that had anchored their mornings for over 2 decades. Emily, 16, and Mark, 13, would eventually stumble out, their teenage groans a counterpoint to the clinking of spoons. Breakfast was a quiet affair, mostly because Wayne wasn't much for small talk before the sun was fully up, and the kids were still half asleep. Then it was out the door, the chill of the morning air hitting his face as he walked to his own truck, already feeling the drag of the day before it had even truly begun. The drive to the garage was short, the streets still dim, the world around him just starting to wake. Pulling into the lot, the familiar smell of oil, gasoline, and burnt rubber was almost a comfort. His kingdom, some might call it. His cage, others might whisper. For Wayne, it was simply where he was. The rhythm of his work was ingrained. The rhythmic whine of the air compressor, the clatter of tools on concrete, the persistent hum of an engine being coaxed back to life. Another day, another broken serpentine belt, another worn-out brake pad, another inexplicable knocking sound that always turned out to be something simple if you just looked close enough. He was good at it, the best, some customers would say. He could hear a problem before he even opened the hood, his intuition a finely tuned instrument built from thousands of hours under countless cars. The satisfaction was fleeting, a small mental nod as another vehicle rolled out, purring smoothly. But it rarely lasted. Soon enough, another one would roll in, presenting the same old puzzle in a slightly different package. The money was always just enough. Enough to keep the lights on, enough to put food on the table, enough for Emily's school trips and Mark's new skateboard. But it was a tightrope walk every single month. A busted water heater meant a month of cutting back on everything else. A sudden doctor's bill meant a familiar, worried conversation with Sarah over the kitchen table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp, tallying up every outgoing dollar against every incoming one. He was a provider, a damn good one, but the weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, a constant, dull ache that no amount of coffee or elbow grease could fix. He was building a comfortable life, sure, a safe little bubble where his family could thrive, but lately, that comfort felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. When the garage was quiet sometimes, when he was alone, staring at the scarred concrete floor or the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, a different kind of quiet would descend inside him. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a room where something important had just been forgotten. He'd see the blur of his father's younger face, a ghost of a dream in his own tired eyes. He'd remember the blueprints he'd drawn as a kid, complicated contraptions that hummed with impossible logic, things he swore he'd build one day. Dee wanted to innovate, to create, to leave his mark on something more than just a perfectly timed ignition or a balanced tire. That boy, the one with the wild imagination and the grease-stained fingers, was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of routine and practicality. He'd always told himself it was enough to be a good husband, a good father, a good mechanic. And it was enough for daily living. But late at night, when the house was silent and the moonlight cut a silver stripe across their bedroom floor, a different voice would whisper. A voice that asked, "Is this all there is?" He had built a life on predictability, on the known, meticulously avoiding the sharp edges of risk. He desettled for good enough because great felt like it lived on another planet, a place fraught with the danger of failure, of losing the stability he'd worked so hard to achieve. The fear was a quiet one, not a shout, but a steady hum beneath his ribs. The fear of falling short, of proving himself not good enough, not strong enough, not smart enough to build anything beyond the ordinary. It kept him rooted, a deep reluctance to step outside the familiar circle of his expertise. He saw his family growing up fast, looking to him, and he wanted to give them more than just a steady paycheck. He wanted to give them a name that meant something, a legacy that stretched further than the annual oil change. But the path to that kind of legacy felt like walking blindfolded into a storm, and Wayne had always preferred the clear, well-worn road. His quiet ambition for their future, that deep yearning for something more, rarely escaped his lips. It lived instead in the unspoken promises he made to himself in the dark, promises he didn't quite know how to keep. The alarm clock, an old digital relic with glowing green numbers, always screamed at 5 a.m. Not chimed, not politely beeped, but screamed. Wayne would hit the snooze with a grunt, his calloused hand finding the button without opening his eyes, buying himself 9 more minutes of a world where bills didn't exist and his back didn't ache. 9 minutes of quiet. Then it screamed again. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the floorboards groaning under his weight, the cold linoleum of the bathroom a rude awakening. Sarah was usually still asleep, curled into a peaceful knot, and Wayne would move like a shadow, careful not to disturb her. Coffee black as motor oil was his first ritual. He'd stand at the kitchen counter, gazing out at the pale pre-dawn light creeping over the neighbors' rooftops, the world still hushed, pregnant with the day's demands. Breakfast was a quick piece of toast, maybe some instant oatmeal, eaten in silence. He'd pull on his worn work clothes, sturdy jeans, a flannel shirt, his work boots heavy as anchors. Each piece felt like armor ready for the battleground of the garage. His drive to Axe Auto Repair was short, just a few miles through the sleepy suburb, past identical rows of houses, each hiding its own version of the daily grind. The shop smelled of oil, gasoline, and burnt rubber, a scent that was as familiar and comforting to Wayne as his own skin, yet lately it had started to feel stale, suffocating. He'd unlock the bay doors, flick on the fluorescent lights that hummed and buzzed like trapped insects, and start the coffee pot. Then the cars would start rolling in. Mr. Henderson's sputtering 8 Corolla misses, Rodriguez's rattling minivan, young Timmy's souped-up Civic with a busted exhaust. Day in, day out, it was the same story, different vehicles. He'd hoist them up, crawl underneath, his face streaked with grease, his knuckles scraped. He knew the internal organs of every make and model like the back of his hand. A broken belt here, a seized caliper there, a transmission on its last legs. He was good at it, damn good. He could diagnose a problem with a listen and a glance, his hands moving with an practiced efficiency that bordered on artistry. Yet there was no satisfaction in it anymore, not like there used to be. It was just fixing, always fixing someone else's broken machine, never building his own. The money was always tight, always. The mortgage payment, the utility bills that seemed to creep higher with every season, Emily's braces, Mark's new hockey equipment, the list was endless. He was a good provider, sure, but provider often felt like treadmill runner. He'd make the money, pay the bills, and by the end of the month, the well was dry again, ready to be refilled with another month of backbreaking labor. Sarah was practical, bless her, never complaining, always finding ways to stretch a dollar. But he saw the lines of worry etched around her eyes, the way she'd sometimes sigh looking at a grocery store receipt. He wanted to ease that burden, wanted to buy her something nice without having to weigh it against 2 weeks of groceries. He'd come home bone-tired, smelling faintly of exhaust and sweat, eat dinner, help Emily with a particularly stubborn algebra problem, listen to Mark recount the epic battles of his latest video game. These moments with his family were his anchors, the bright spots in a monotonous day. But even then, an unease would settle over him. He'd look at Emily, so bright, so full of potential, dreaming of college, and then at Mark, still a kid, but with that spark of curiosity that reminded Wayne of himself once upon a time. What future was he truly building for them? A comfortable one, yes, a safe one. But was safe enough? The question gnawed at him. It wasn't a sudden storm, but a slow, persistent erosion like water wearing down rock. He saw his friends, some of them taking leaps, opening their own small businesses, moving to new towns for better opportunities, even just picking up a new hobby with a fierce passion. And here he was, Wayne, the reliable mechanic, the steady hand. He was reliable, he was steady. But he was also stuck. His buried dreams were like old tools in a forgotten corner of the garage, rusting under a thick layer of dust. There was a time long ago when he'd tinkered with designs for custom hot rods, sketching elaborate engines and sleek bodies in old notebooks. He'd even dreamed of taking a welding class, learning advanced fabrication, building something from scratch that was truly his own, not just repairing what someone else had made. But life had a way of intervening. Responsibilities piled up, the hours at the shop stretched longer, and the comfort of the familiar had slowly, insidiously taken hold. It was easier to come home and just be tired, to fall into the predictable rhythm, than to confront the effort, the risk, the potential failure of pursuing those old ambitions. He'd tell himself it was foolish, childish even. A man his age, with a family to support, didn't chase pipe dreams. He provided. That was his purpose. But the silence in his own head, whenever he stopped moving, would be filled with the quiet accusation of what he wasn't doing. He had a deep-seated fear of insignificance, a terror that when he was gone, he would just be another name on a faded ledger, another gruff mechanic who did his job and then disappeared. He wanted more for his name, more for his family's future, something that would echo, not just fade. He wanted to build something that outlived him, something that meant he hadn't just gotten by, but had truly lived. And that yearning, rarely voiced, was becoming a heavy burden, a constant, unspoken question mark at the end of every one of his monotonous days. He looked at his hands, calloused, grease-stained, capable of so much, and wondered what they could have built, what they should have built if only he hadn't been so afraid to try. That unspoken question mark hung heavy in the air, heavier still after his Sunday visits to his father. His dad, now 78, had slowed down considerably. The once strong, boisterous man was now a little stooped, a little frail, his gaze often drifting to some distant memory only he could see. Wayne would bring coffee and donuts, sit in the old armchair across from him, and listen more than he spoke. This particular Sunday, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something vaguely medicinal. Wayne's father, Frank, was staring out the window at the neighbor's meticulously mowed lawn. "You know, Wayne," he started, his voice a little softer than usual, a whisper against the quiet hum of the afternoon. "Your grandpa, he always wanted to open his own cabinet shop, said he had ideas, designs that were truly his. But he never did it. too worried about the mortgage, about putting food on the table. Wayne nodded, waiting. He knew this story or variations of it. "And me," Frank continued, turning his gaze, a profound weariness etched into his eyes. "I always dreamt of buying that old fishing boat down by the docks, fixing her up, taking folks out for charter trips. Imagine that, son, the sea air, the big catch." He chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that held no humor. "But then your mother, she was always a worrier, and the job at the plant was steady, reliable, couldn't risk it, could I? Couldn't upset the apple cart." He looked directly at Wayne then, and in his father's eyes, Wayne saw not just regret, but a deep, cavernous ache of unfulfilled potential. It wasn't an accusation, not exactly. It was worse. It was a plea, a warning. "Your grandpappy, he died thinking about those cabinets he never built. And me? I'll likely go thinking about that boat that just rusted away on the docks because I was too comfortable in my routine, too scared to rock the boat for real, literal boats. Too comfortable to chase something that might have truly mattered." Frank paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. "Comfort, Wayne. It's a quiet killer. It'll lull you to sleep while your best years just slip by, and then you wake up and all you've got are the what-ifs for company." The words struck Wayne like a wrench to the gut. They echoed in the sterile quiet of his father's living room, not just about old boats and cabinets, but about Wayne's own dusty welding mask, his neglected fabrication books, the workshop dreams he'd packed away with his youth. He saw his own future laid out before him, a familiar path leading straight to the same quiet regret. His own comfortable monotony, the very thing he clung to, was a slow drip, eroding the edges of his soul, leading him to a similar unfulfilled future. He saw how comfort had prevented his father, and now himself, from building something truly lasting, something that wasn't just about getting by. He left his father's house that afternoon feeling hollowed out, as if a part of him had already died alongside Frank's lost dreams. The drive home was a blur. The familiar sights of his suburb, usually a source of quiet contentment, now felt stifling, a cage he'd built for himself, brick by comfortable brick. He went through the motions of dinner, helping Emily with her algebra, listening to Mark recount some video game triumph. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying his father's words, each one a hammer blow against the walls of his self-delusion. That night, Wayne found himself staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. The house was utterly silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen below and Sarah's soft, even breathing beside him. He felt wide awake, his mind a relentless churn. Frank's words had ripped open a wound Wayne hadn't even realized was festering. "Comfort, Wayne. It's a quiet killer." His father's voice was a ghost in the dark. Wayne turned on his side, punching his pillow, though there was no real anger, just a deep, cold ache. He thought about his days, indistinguishable from one to the next. The 5 a.m. alarm, the familiar drive, the grime under his fingernails, the endless parade of engines that all sounded the same after a while. He was a good mechanic, damn good, the best in town maybe. But was that it? Was that his legacy? To keep other people's machines running while his own spirit idled? He remembered the excitement he used to feel, the sparks of an idea, the rush of learning something new. Where had that gone? Buried under layers of bills, responsibilities, and that insidious fear of failure. He was so terrified of losing what he had, the stable job, the house, the ability to provide, that he hadn't dared to reach for anything more. He had told himself it was practical, responsible. Now, lying in the dark, the truth was brutal. It was cowardice. He'd settled for good enough instead of striving for great. He had been building a comfortable life for his family, yes, but not a legacy that would truly outlive him. He was a steady hand, a reliable provider, but a whisper in his gut, a quiet scream in the 3 a.m. silence, told him he was becoming just like his father, haunted by the ghost of what he could have been. He was afraid of insignificance, yet he was actively building a life that was comfortable, predictable, and ultimately forgettable. The thought made his stomach clench. He had always wanted to build something that outlived him, something that meant he hadn't just gotten by but had truly lived. And the comfortable rut he dug for himself was preventing exactly that. His hands, capable of fixing almost anything, felt useless, tied down by invisible chains of his own making. The realization settled over him like a heavy blanket, not suffocating but chilling. It wasn't just a thought. It was a cold, hard fact carved into the silence of his bedroom. This ain't it, Wayne. This ain't gonna be all you are. He sat up slowly, the springs of the old mattress groaning under his weight, a familiar sound of his comfortable yet slowly suffocating life. Sarah was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. He envied her peace, but he also knew this unrest was necessary. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the cool floorboards a shock to his bare feet. The clock on the bedside table glowed 3:47 a.m. Too early for work, too late to pretend he could just go back to sleep. This wasn't an impulse. It was a slow, grinding realization that had finally reached its breaking point. There wasn't a sudden flash of lightning or a booming voice from above, just a quiet, unshakable certainty that settled deep in his gut. Enough. Not enough as in, I've had enough of this life, but enough of this way of living. Enough of the fear, enough of the comfort that felt more like a cage, enough of watching his own potential slowly rust away. He didn't know what enough truly meant, not yet. Didn't have a plan, not even a hazy outline. All he knew was that the path he was on, the well-worn groove of predictable comfort, was leading him to a future he now deeply feared. A future of regret, of quiet insignificance, of a legacy measured only by bills paid and cars repaired. He didn't want his kids, Emily and Mark, to look back and see a man who simply existed. He wanted them to see someone who built, who strived, who wasn't afraid to get a little lost in pursuit of something lasting. The thought of stepping out, of doing something new, sent a familiar shiver of apprehension down his spine. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, blindfolded. His brain screamed at him, "Stay put. You're stable. You're safe. Don't mess it up." That was the voice of comfort, the siren song that had kept him tethered to the familiar for so long. But something had shifted. The fear of staying the same now outweighed the fear of changing. He got up and walked to the garage, careful not to wake anyone. The familiar scent of oil, metal, and old tires was usually a comfort, a reassurance of his domain. Tonight, it felt like an accusation. His garage was a museum of good enough. Everything had a place, everything was functional, but nothing was pushing the boundaries. He flicked on the single bare bulb hanging over his workbench. The light was harsh, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, but also the pile of old metal parts he'd been meaning to get around to for years. There was an old, rusted engine block in the corner he'd salvaged, thinking maybe he'd make a coffee table out of it or something. He'd never even touched it, always an excuse, too tired, too busy, too comfortable. His eyes drifted to a shelf where a stack of untouched magazines lay, Modern Fabrication Monthly. He'd subscribed years ago, fascinated by the intricate metalwork, the laser cutting, the CNC machines. He'd bought them, flipped through them, dreamed a little, then put them down, telling himself he didn't have the time or the money for such fancy hobbies. He picked up the top one. The cover showed a stunning, complex sculpture crafted from steel, a fusion of art and engineering. He opened it to an article about a small, community-run workshop that taught advanced metal fabrication to at-risk youth. The article talked about how embracing new techniques, stepping into the unknown, allowed these kids to build not just objects, but confidence, futures, and a sense of lasting contribution. Discomfort, the author wrote, was the crucible where true skill and meaningful legacy were forged. Wayne's gaze lingered on that word, discomfort. He used to think it was something to be avoided, like a pothole in the road. Now he was starting to see it as the road itself, the path he had avoided. He closed the magazine slowly. The clock in the house chimed 4 times, still hours before his alarm. He could go back to bed. He could forget this whole 3 a.m. revelation, chalk it up to a bad night's sleep. The old Wayne would have. But the new Wayne, the one quietly forging himself in the furnace of regret and nascent ambition, felt a different kind of pull. His eyes fell on an old, forgotten arc welder tucked away under a dusty tarp. He'd bought it secondhand years ago, thinking he might expand his repair business to include some custom work. It was heavy, a beast he'd barely learned how to strike an arc with. It intimidated him. It was uncomfortable. He pushed the tarp off. The welder sat there, silent, an unspoken challenge. The first day, the first step into the unknown. He didn't know how to start with that community workshop idea or teaching kids or building a legacy. But he knew how to start with this. He looked at his hands, not useless now, but trembling slightly with a mix of fear and excitement. He pulled the thick leather gloves from a hook, their worn texture familiar, yet now imbued with a new purpose. He found his old welding helmet, the darkened visor scratched but functional. The garage was still cold. The world outside was still asleep, and he was standing there, a man on the precipice of his own making. He knew he was tired. He knew his body craved the warmth of his bed. He knew he'd be dragging ass at the shop later. Every fiber of his being screamed for the familiar, the safe, the easy. He plugged in the welder. The machine hummed to life, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the concrete floor. It was a sound of raw power, of potential, of heat and light and transformation. He picked up a piece of scrap metal, a thick, rusted steel plate he'd meant to toss. He adjusted the settings, fumbling a little, remembering the basics from a long-forgotten manual. His hands were clumsy, his mind racing with doubts. "What are you doing, Wayne? You're gonna mess it up. You're gonna burn yourself. You're gonna make a fool of yourself." He took a deep breath, the metallic scent of the shop filling his lungs. This wasn't about perfection. It was about doing, about showing up, about making a conscious choice to step into the discomfort. He lowered the helmet. The world went dark, save for the faint glow of the pilot light. He touched the electrode to the metal. A blinding flash erupted, a spray of sparks, a crackling hiss. It was messy. It was crude. It was nowhere near the smooth, precise bead he'd seen in the magazines. But he was doing it. He was moving. He was starting. And in that moment, the raw, searing discomfort of the arc felt more honest, more real than any comfort he'd ever known. He stayed out there for an hour, maybe more. The garage air grew thick with the smell of ozone and burnt metal. His hands cramped, his eyes watered behind the helmet, and the welds he laid down looked like bird droppings, lumpy, uneven, full of porosity. He knew he was terrible, knew it in his bones, but with each sputter and flash he was pushing back against something. The fear, the inertia, the damn comfort. The next morning his shoulders screamed. His neck was stiff, and a dull headache throbbed behind his eyes. Sarah gave him a questioning look over breakfast, but he just grunted, pushing food around his plate. At the shop, every wrench turn, every heavy lift felt amplified by the soreness. His body, accustomed to its familiar rhythm, was protesting the sudden disruption. After a full day of busting knuckles on customer cars, all he wanted was his worn armchair and a cold beer. But the image of his father's eyes, heavy with regret, flickered in his mind. He dragged himself back to the garage that night. The welder looked less like a symbol of potential and more like a heavy, intimidating chunk of metal. He stared at it, then at the workbench piled with dirty rags and old tools. His breath caught in his throat. "Just skip it tonight, Wayne. One night won't hurt. You're beat." The temptation was a physical weight pressing him down. It would be so easy to just walk away, close the door, and pretend he hadn't seen it. But a different kind of ache started then, deeper than the muscle soreness. A feeling he was letting himself down, letting his future self down. He flipped the switch. The hum of the machine was less defiant tonight, more like a challenge. He picked up the torch, his hands shaking slightly from fatigue and a quiet dread. The welds were still ugly, still far from what he imagined. He burned through half a spool of wire, each misstep a small defeat, each completed, if imperfect, beat a tiny, stubborn victory. He quit only when his body literally couldn't hold the torch steady anymore. Day 3 came, then day 5. The novelty had worn off entirely. Now it was just a grind. His evening welding sessions became a quiet, solitary battle. His family noticed the change, though no one said much. Sarah would leave a thermos of coffee on the workbench, a silent acknowledgement of his late nights. Emily, his daughter, sometimes peered into the garage, her brow furrowed with concern before retreating to her room. Mark, his son, just seemed confused why Dad wasn't watching the game. Some nights Wayne just sat there, helmet on the bench, staring at the raw materials. The internet tutorials he'd found made it look so damn easy. Smooth, consistent beads, sparks flying just right. His own work was a crude mockery. He'd throw down the torch in frustration more than once, the clang echoing in the quiet garage. What's the point? He'd ask himself. You're not good at this. You're wasting time. You're tired. The old comfortable voice, the one that had kept him steady for so long, was now his fiercest opponent. It promised ease, rest, the familiar warmth of inertia. One particularly bad night, after a customer had chewed him out at the shop and a tricky repair had gone south, he walked into the garage and just stopped. He didn't even turn on the light. The faint glow from the streetlights filtered through the grime on the window. He stared at the welder, a silent, dark silhouette in the corner. He thought about his dad, talking about the business he almost started, the trip he almost took. Almost. That word hung heavy in the air, a ghost. Was that what he was building for himself? A life of almosts? He picked up a piece of the metal he'd been working on. It was ugly, scarred, uneven, but it was welded. It held together. It wasn't perfect, but it was done. And he was the one who did it. He felt the rough edges, the slight warp from the heat. He didn't flip the switch that night. He just stood there, holding the piece of metal, feeling the weight of it, the tangible proof of his clumsy, persistent effort. He wasn't quitting, not tonight, not ever. He just needed a minute to remember why he'd started. By day 14, the muscle memory was starting to kick in, slowly, painfully. The lines weren't straight yet, not by a long shot, but they were less spastic. He wasn't burning through metal quite as often. He was still frustrated, still exhausted, still battling that nagging voice of doubt, but something had shifted. It wasn't about being good anymore, it was about showing up. It was about choosing discomfort, every single evening, even when every fiber of his being yearned for the easy way out. He was beginning to understand that the real strength wasn't in avoiding the pain, but in moving through it, one clumsy, ugly weld at a time. By day 20-something, the ugly welds started looking less like a child's scrawl and more like an apprentice's first attempt. Still not perfect, still plenty of grinding to do, but the metal wasn't collapsing on itself. Wayne found himself thinking about the projects even when he wasn't in the garage. His hands, usually just tools for the job, were now itching to create. He'd catch himself staring at a broken piece of machinery at work, not just seeing the repair, but seeing how he could improve it, how he could fabricate a part that wouldn't just fix it but make it stronger. Sarah noticed it first. He was still coming in late, still smelled of metal and sweat and ozone, but the lines around his mouth weren't quite as tight. There was a different kind of quiet about him. Not the heavy, resigned quiet he used to carry, but a focused, almost humming silence. One evening he walked in, his shirt smudged with grease, and instead of just heading for the shower, he stopped by the kitchen table where Emily was struggling with a complex drawing for her art class. He didn't say much, just leaned over, pointed with a calloused finger. "You're trying to force the curve. Let the material tell you what it wants. Don't fight it." Emily looked up, surprised, then back at her paper, a faint understanding dawning. He didn't even realize he was talking about welding, just the principles of working with something stubborn until it yielded. The kids started calling his corner of the garage Dad's Lab. Place of mystery and sparks, not just the usual oil changes and broken lawnmowers. Mark, the 13-year-old, even poked his head in a few times, a rare occurrence. He'd just watch, mesmerized by the blue flash of the welder, the way metal screamed then fused. Wayne wouldn't invite him in, wouldn't say much. Just a nod, acknowledging his presence, then back to the task. But there was a difference in those moments. A shared, unspoken understanding that something real was happening in there. Hope, that quiet, fragile thing, began to unfurl within him. Not a loud, triumphant hope, but a steady, persistent hum like a well-tuned engine. He wasn't just fixing things anymore, he was building. And in the act of building, he was rebuilding something within himself. The fear of failure hadn't vanished, but it had shrunk, replaced by a more powerful drive to see what he could make. Weeks blurred into months. Wayne's proficiency with the welder grew. He started tackling bigger, more complex pieces, creating intricate supports and sturdy frames that no one would have believed he could make. His hands, always capable, now moved with a new precision, a confident grace that came from countless hours of deliberate, often frustrating practice. The community workshop idea, initially just a fleeting thought, began to solidify. He mentioned it once to Frank, a retired shop teacher from the high school down at the hardware store. Frank, a man Wayne had always respected for his endless enthusiasm, had lit up like a Christmas tree. "Wayne, that's what this town needs. A place for the kids, a real skill-building shop, not just another video game parlor." Before he knew it, Wayne found himself at a town hall meeting, not in the back row like usual, but actually awkwardly standing at the microphone. He felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the urge to just sit down and let someone else do the talking. But he thought of his dad, the regret in his voice, the almosts. He thought of Emily struggling with her drawing, of Mark watching him weld, of all the kids in town with hands itching to create but nowhere to learn. He didn't make a grand speech. He just talked, gruffly, practically, about the old, unused storage building behind the rec center. How it could be gutted, reinforced, equipped. How a few good hands and some elbow grease could turn it into a place where kids could learn welding, carpentry, basic mechanics. He spoke about the satisfaction of fixing something with your own hands, the dignity of knowing how to build, not just buy. He spoke about giving kids a purpose beyond screens, a tangible skill, a foundation. He didn't use fancy words like legacy or empire, but everyone in that room heard it in his voice, a deep conviction that resonated. He offered to lead the structural work, to design the layout, to teach the first batch of kids himself. A ripple went through the room. People looked at Wayne, this quiet mechanic, in a new light. Soon, Wayne was spending every free evening and weekend not just in his garage, but down at the old storage building, his truck overflowing with tools. He rallied a small crew of volunteers, a motley bunch of retirees and younger parents eager to see something positive happen for their town. Designed sturdy workbenches from salvaged lumber, rigged up safe welding booths, and meticulously installed the equipment. He wasn't just building a workshop. He was building a foundation, a place where hands-on skills would be valued again. When the doors of the Riverside Community Workshop finally opened, a line of eager teenagers, some skeptical, some bright-eyed, snaked around the block. Wayne, in his usual faded work shirt and jeans, stood by the entrance, a silent sentinel. He still wasn't a man of many words, but his presence was a reassurance, a quiet promise of patience and practical wisdom. He taught them how to hold a torch, how to measure twice and cut once, how to respect the power of the tools. He taught them that frustration was just a step on the path to mastery, that comfort was a trap, and that the real satisfaction came from pushing past what you thought you could do. One afternoon, Mark, who'd finally mustered the courage to join a class, was struggling with a tricky joint. He detried 3 times, each weld uglier than the last. He was about to throw down the torch in frustration when Wayne, who'd been watching from a distance, approached. No lecture, no harsh words, just a quiet, "You're fighting it. Take a breath. Listen to the metal." He put a hand on Mark's shoulder, a rare paternal gesture. "It's not about being perfect the first time, son. It's about staying with it. That's where the real strength is built." Mark looked at his dad, really looked at him, and saw not just a mechanic, but a builder, a teacher, a man who had found something more. A quiet fire burning steady. Mark looked at his dad, really looked at him, and saw not just a mechanic, but a builder, a teacher, a man who had found something more. A quiet fire burning steady. Around the house, Sarah and Emily started to notice it too. It wasn't that Wayne suddenly became a chatterbox. He was still Wayne, a man who spoke in measured sentences, often ending with a nod. But the silence had changed. It wasn't the heavy, preoccupied silence of a man carrying an unspoken weight anymore. Now it was a comfortable, contented quiet, filled with the hum of his mind, not the grind of his anxieties. He'd come home from the shop, eat dinner, and instead of disappearing into the garage or the TV, he'd actually sit with them, sometimes just listening to Emily talk about her school play or Mark recount a particularly challenging skateboard trick. His eyes, once always holding a flicker of distant worry, seemed clearer, more present. One evening, Sarah found him sketching designs for a new kind of workbench, one that could adjust height for different users, including those in wheelchairs, on a greasy napkin. "Still at it?" she asked softly, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips, a genuine, unforced smile she hadn't seen in years. "Got an idea for the next phase of the workshop," he mumbled, pushing the napkin towards her. "Make it truly accessible for everyone. It's not just about fixing cars anymore, Sarah. It's about fixing futures." She looked at the crude drawing, then at him, and understood. He wasn't chasing comfort anymore, he was chasing meaning. And in doing so, he was finding a kind of peace that had long eluded them both. The small house in the working-class suburb felt bigger, filled with a new kind of possibility, a silent hum of purpose. Weeks turned into months, and the Riverside Community Workshop blossomed. What started as a few donated tools and Wayne's tireless effort became a beacon. The hum of welders, the scent of sawdust, the focused chatter of teenagers learning to craft with their hands filled the air. Wayne was there every evening, every weekend, not as an obligation, but as a calling. He wasn't just teaching mechanics. He was teaching perseverance, the dignity of skilled labor, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing something tangible created by your own effort. He'd found a way to pour his deepest anxieties, his fear of insignificance, into something that mattered, something that would long outlive the wear and tear of his own hands. Mark, once tentative and easily frustrated, was now a regular fixture, helping the younger kids, his hands confident with a cutting torch. Emily, though not drawn to the trades, volunteered to help organize the workshop's outreach, her sharp mind making sure grants were filed and community events were promoted. They saw their father not just as a provider, but as a quiet force, a man who had built a space where anyone could find their own grit. Sarah would often visit, bringing coffee and homemade cookies, watching him with a renewed admiration, a sense of awe for the man she had married, now fully realized. He hadn't bought a bigger house or a fancier car, but he'd built something far more valuable, a living legacy. He traded the comfort of predictability for the profound satisfaction of impact. Wayne, standing amidst the rhythmic clang of hammers and the buzz of power tools, would often lean against a workbench, watching the young faces, some still fresh, some already etched with the struggles of their young lives. He used to think safe was the same as good, but safe, he now knew, just meant you're stuck in neutral. Real good, the kind that lasts, that comes when you ain't afraid to get your hands dirty with something new, even if you might stumble, even if you might fail a few times. That's how you build something worth remembering.